The idea is that the individual who allows their ego to self-justify all the time never learns.
Hello and welcome to Spiritually Hungry.
Hello.
Hello. I'm excited for our conversation today. Today's topic is for anyone who's ever chosen to be right instead of be happy, for anyone who feels hurt or easily offended, for the perfectionists and the people pleasers, and for anyone who has a nagging voice in the back of their mind demanding attention, validation, and control. Can any of our listeners guess what all of these things have in common in one word?
We all do it all the time.
Bum, ba-da-dum, bum, 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 bum. One word.
Well, I know.
One three-letter word. Ego. Do you remember that commercial, Let Go My Ego? If you let go of my ego. Ego.
Lego.
Ego. Lego. It's stealing your peace and you don't realize it. It's whispering lies of inadequacy, fueling your anxieties and blocking you from your true potential. Today, we're not talking about taming the ego, but really deflating it. And we're going to give tools on how to break through to the other side where freedom awaits you. So let's talk a little bit more before we get into the spiritual. I know you want to go into a deep dive.
Right, because I was thinking about it, but we can go into that later. But the reality is, I'll just give a quick preview, that the ego, which we will clarify exactly which parts of it we're referring to, is actually the greatest barrier, not just to our emotional and psychological lives being as they should be, meaning in a better place than they are now, but really as a way to open ourselves up to great blessings.
Yeah, because I don't think that people really realize ego. I think we all know we have it. Obviously, I think sometimes we recognize when it comes out, but usually when it's like roaring and you can't deny it. But ego is a shapeshifter. It comes in many, many different forms.
Can I share what I've in preparing for this podcast? You don't seem very happy.
Sure, where you going?
No. So, we've spoken about the ego before. We spent a lot of time speaking, in our lectures and in our personal conversations with students about the ego. But I actually found, as I was preparing for this podcast, what I think is a beautiful, powerful explanation of what the ego is. And it's from the psychologist Greg Henricks. And he says, and again, this is part of the ego, but the ego is the mental organ of justification.
No, I love that. That's so well said. I love when people come with pithy ways to describe something.
But it's true.
Say it again.
Because I think
is the organ.
The ego is the mental organ of justification. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about why that's so dangerous, but that's really what it is. Because we're in this world to grow and to change. And growth and change comes from realizing where we lack and are wrong. But the ego is always it's crazy. And I'm sure if we're honest with ourselves, this is the default to where we always go, whether it's in an argument, whether it's in our daily lives, we're right, they're wrong, right? I mean, we have this conversation often in the car, right? If somebody honks their horn at us, immediately the ego comes and says, you're right, they're wrong.
Mm-hmm. And then all kinds of bad behavior follows usually.
Sometimes.
Scary.
Sometimes.
Not within us, but, we see it on TV a lot.
Sometimes in us.
Well, no, but like the crazy, like.
Right. But I think, like I said.
Like what is road rage? That's ego at its finest.
Right.
It has like what is it called? Like the spotlight of the feature film of your life.
Right. And I think if you take those two truths, one is that we're in this world to grow and to change. And second is that the ego is the greatest block for that because it is the organ of justification. And again, I would say mostly false justification. The ego comes in. Like when you're right, the ego does not usually come in. When you're really right? That's not when the ego comes in. The ego comes in full force when you're wrong.
Funnily enough, I think when you're really right and you know it, you're okay with nobody knowing it. Like,
right.
When you're really like, because you're just like, this is just so, I can't even have this conversation. Like, it's just not, okay, we're speaking a different language, really.
Right.
I've always been inspired by successful people who keep persevering and growing their craft and skill, but I'm most impressed with successful people who are humbled by their success and not the other way around, because that happens very often. I think there's 7 traits that I found this somewhere a while ago, and I always like this list that intelligent people embody. But I think this is really what that kind of success, people who are not influenced by it and their ego's not now in charge, I think they have these traits. They don't get easily offended. They read more than they talk. They enjoy intelligent discourse. They quickly admit when they're wrong. They're comfortable changing their opinion. They surround themselves with intelligence, and they seek to understand every perspective on a topic. Now, it seems really basic, right? But most of us don't actually navigate our days like this, certainly not our exchanges and conversations, both in the office or in the bedroom or in the kitchen. It's not very much that. And I think it's a good list kind of to look at and say, okay, how much of my time is in that kind of expression or contemplation?
Exactly. I think I wrote down as you were saying that, and I think it's something that really drives me, and I really hope for our listeners inspires them, right? Humility is the sign of wisdom, right? Because very simply put—
Say that again, because I think that people would not equate the two, and it's such a powerful truth.
Right. Humility is the sign of wisdom, because the more you know, the more you realize there is so much more to know.
The less you know, right?
But if you don't know a lot, then your little corner of knowledge seems to you like all that there is. Oh, maybe there's, 10% more. I can tell you personally, and I've been studying wisdom for, 35, 40 years now, that the more I study and the more I understand, it becomes clearer and clearer to me that there is so much beyond what I'm currently comprehending. And that hopefully gives you a humility, right? So whenever I see somebody who is quick when you're having a conversation, or even if you're having a debate or an argument, quick to come and doesn't even pay attention to what you're saying, it's a lack of wisdom. Because if you have wisdom, if you have real wisdom, then the more wisdom you have, the more humility that would come with that. I've
learned over time to become really quiet in those kinds of conversations. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to engage, because it's clearly the intention's not really for an exchange. It's more to prove your point or to be heard. I think King David is a great example of somebody who showed humility, right? He was a shepherd, and he was called to play music for King Saul, right? When he would become sad. And eventually he was chosen to be the next king. But he went back to, he would come into the palace, he would come and play music, then he'd go back and tend to the animals. Like, that's the kind of, and it's very hard to hold that space where you are now in a world where you maybe are recognized, or you're finding some success, or even if it's moderate success, to not let that influence who you become in a way that you ultimately didn't intend to become.
Right. I think it's important that you constantly ask the question. There's a fundamental kabbalistic understanding regarding the internal and the external, that everything in our world has an internal aspect and an external aspect. And every human being has his or her internal aspect, our soul, and we have our external aspect, the ego, the body. And you have to always question, what is driving me? I cannot tell you. And you look, I'm sure every one of our listeners can look out into the world, and it's relatively easy to spot externally people who are externally motivated, meaning they need accolades, they need recognition, and people who are internally motivated. Now, it's not so important, although sometimes it's helpful to know as you look outside, but really ask yourself the question, what's motivating me when I wake up in the morning and I'm driven to work? Is it, how much of my motivation is internal, for the internal aspects of things, and how much of my motivation is the external aspects of things?
Right. So there are a few ways that ego shows up. I mean, in essence, basically, we want less ego, more consciousness. And the more conscious you are, the less ego you will have.
Right.
Conscious in the terms of expanding your understanding of the world and your place in it.
Right. And I would say, again, there's a teaching from one of the Kabbalists, my father's teacher, as a matter of fact, who said that if you're truly in spiritual pursuits and studying of true wisdom, you're so aware of what you need to change that you don't have the time to be looking outside to what other people need to change and what they're doing wrong. And that's a clear indication of whether you're on a true spiritual path. Because and it's important we understand that looking inside and discovering more things that we want to change, that's not a negative. That's the most positive thing that you can do. Because we came into this world with the purpose of ever growing and ever changing. And the only way you can do that is by discovering those new parts that maybe you didn't recognize before, recognize how important they were about you that need to change and you need to grow.
It's that self-awareness. And it's also how we view others, whether we're jealous or we gossip or we judge them, times when we're selfish or we act with pride, right? So it's what we do internally, but it's also how we view others. That's all tied in with the ego. Perhaps, and it's interesting too, because I don't think that people look at it this way. When we act in ego, it pulls us away from our authentic self, right?
Our internal.
Our soul, from our essence. And there's one person I know that every time their ego is poked, awakened, right? And they're not conscious of this. They come back with comments like, I'm a good person. I don't deserve this, which is code for no one has the right to feel anything other than what I'm feeling. So it's easy to kind of trick ourselves where we don't realize that the ego is giving us information all the time, changing the story, changing the narrative, changing our view. And if we don't stop and call it out every day, we think that that's actually who we are, when in fact, it's really pulling you away from your essence.
Right. I think you've touched on a really important point, because my hope for ourselves and our listeners is that this conversation is a practical inspiration. What you just said is something really important. I'd like to ask our listeners right now, stop for a moment, think about today or think about yesterday, and find a moment that you thought you were reacting to something, but it was really your ego. And if you can't find those, that just simply means, the ego is dragging you by your nose. And I know that I try at least once a day to realize, not just to realize, but then to focus on, say, wow. Like I know, I think it was like 2 or 3 days ago, we were having a disagreement or an argument or conversation, however you want to call it. Mm-hmm. And I realized internally that and this, I'm sure most people, in relationships, almost always your initial reaction in an argument is going to be your ego's reaction, not your true soul's reaction. And you're wrong. If you stop for 2.5 millisecond, of course this is wrong. Of course the argument I'm making is even wrong, but it overpowers, the ego overpowers us. Is
that what you came to after our conversation?
It is. But I try to do it every day. And I feel very strongly for our listeners that you have to see your ego at least once a day.
And sometimes it's pointed out to us and sometimes it's not. And I think those times where they're both hard for different reasons. When it's pointed out, the ego then doubles down, right? Like, what about you? That kind of thing. But then also, sometimes it's not pointed out. And in those moments, if I'm starting to feel uncomfortable or something made me upset, I stop and say, okay, where's this coming from? Why do I feel this way? What is the reaction? Where is truth? Where is the lie? The lie being the ego, right? And I think that has to be a practice that is taken on for the rest of your life, right? It's the only thing that will keep you, because I think that also people tend to lie to themselves. And so
everybody's lying to themselves
big fat
every day.
Liars, yes, but they don't think that they are.
Of course not. By the way, it's not them, it's their ego, but we're allowing the ego to be integrated into our own experience and be directed by it.
Exactly. Integrated, directed. Absolutely.
So there's
good words. Yes.
Yes. There's a very famous psychologist, Elliot Aronson, and he wrote a famous book, by the way, if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. It's called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me.
Oh, I love that.
And he brings examples of how, and this is why the ego is, by the way, he's a very, very interesting guy, a very influential psychologist, but interesting, but in his biography is that when he was going to college, he was not planning to be a psychologist. I think it was going to be an accountant or a lawyer or something like that. His family was a Jewish who just immigrated. I think he was second generation immigrated to the United States. And his dad really wanted, because they didn't have a lot of money, so his dad really wanted to become, one of those, an accountant or lawyer. But anyway, so he's in college and he accidentally walks into Abraham Maslow's class.
Wow.
And he was like, oh my God, there's actually a whole
world.
a whole science that deals with questions that I've been asking. And really, so he
That's
changed.
So cool.
So I love those moments where that changed his entire life trajectory.
Yeah.
So anyway, so in that book, Elliot Aronson, writes that the biggest mistakes and staying in the biggest mistakes is this idea of self justification, right? He's the one who really delves deeply into the cognitive dissonance, and we're all living in that. And really, at the core of all this is the ego. Is the ego that is like, oh my God, don't ever be wrong, don't ever be wrong, no matter what.
You'll be dead.
Keep the relationship miserable, but be right. Keep your job terrible, but be right. So there's a story that my father would often repeat, and he mentioned that he received it from his teacher, who received it from his teacher. It's a very ancient story with a very important lesson. And the story goes that in, a few hundred years ago, Eastern Europe, there was this guy, his name was Moshe, and he worked in the palace of one of the local lords. And Moshe was a simple man. He would, clean, he would bring the wood, he would bring water when they needed from the well, and so on and so forth. And one day, the lord of the house goes away on a few-week travel. And the other workers there really didn't like Moshe. They thought he was an idiot, so they wanted to have some fun with him. So one night, they're drinking together, and they give him more and more and more and more to drink, completely blacks out. So after he's out, they take off his peasant clothes, and they dress him in the Lord's sleeping gowns, and they bring him and he put him into the Lord's bed. And he sleeps, he wakes up. And as he wakes up, 4 servants come in, and they say, Master, what can we bring you for breakfast? And he's looking around, he's like, I'm not, he's internally saying, I'm not a master. But they're treating me, maybe he starts thinking, maybe, I am a master. So he says what he wants to eat for breakfast. So excited anyway, even if it's not true. He eats an amazing breakfast. They dress him in the master's clothes. Throughout the whole day, he's served as the master of the house. They're having fun, but he's starting to buy into it. A day goes by, a second day goes by. By the third day, he starts walking around the beautiful palace. And he walks into this beautiful library. The real master of the house was a very learned man, and he read almost every book he can get his hand on. So a library filled with thousands and thousands of books. He enters into the library, and of course, Moshe never went to school, doesn't even know what a letter looks like, certainly doesn't know how to read. And he starts picking down the books, and he's like, I'm the master, and all these are mine. Let me see if I can understand them. He opens up the books, and he sees shapes and letters, and can't make it all out. He takes one out. He's hoping to find a coloring book or pictures. Nothing. They're all words. Then he starts thinking to himself, maybe I should ask somebody to help me learn what these books have. But then he's like, you know what? I'm the master. And if I'm the master, and I don't know how to read, and I don't know what any of these books mean, there probably is nobody in the world who knows what any of these books mean. Wow. So, of course, I'm not going to ask anybody. The idea is that the individual who allows their ego to self-justify all the time never learns. Not only do they never learn, and this is the worst part, they think there's nobody in the world who knows more than them who could teach them.
Wow.
And that, I think, is such a... I
never heard the story.
Oh, really? It's funny.
I love it.
The background to this is about 1986 or 87. I was with my father in Jerusalem, and we bumped into somebody who he had known, and he was telling me the story about this person who was in proximity to wisdom but never gained wisdom because he thought. So this person was somebody who could have been a student to my father's teacher, but because he assumed he had all the wisdom there was to know, he never took the opportunity to learn from a great Kabbalist.
That's so scary. And I love that your father then shared the story with you and you're sharing with us.
Yeah. And
my Virgo mind's like, where was the master, the real master this whole time? That doesn't even matter. But it's such a powerful story.
Right. And
we do this all the time.
We do it all the time. We're doing it all the time. I think this is, like I said, really think about the last argument you had with your spouse, your partner. Think about the last time you got upset at work.
But also think about the last time you asked for help or admitted you didn't know something.
Right. Or
you're on a call and everybody seems to be understanding, but you don't get it. Do you actually say, wait a second, I need that explained? Or do you just sit quiet? Like it shows up in so many ways.
Absolutely. And I think, so we talked about the self-justifying part of the ego, which is, again, so prevalent. And again, if you don't catch yourself, if you can't catch one time a day,
we think it's us. I think that's the biggest. We can't differentiate between our essence,
but
our
if you
soul,
think about
and
it,
our ego.
right.
If you never call it out, it is the director of your movie, and you don't know it.
But if you think about it for 2.5 seconds, right? So you had an argument with your spouse, and you made an argument, they made an argument, you started yelling, they started yelling, you got angrier, they got angrier, and you were sure you were right, they were sure they were right. If you take 2.5 seconds, or 2.5 minutes, or a half hour, and you think about the things you said, and what your thought process was, and you catch, oh my God, I knew that argument wasn't right. I knew that I wasn't really listening. I knew, and then, so why? Ask yourself the question. So I knew that what I did wasn't right. Something within me said I should justify it, but why? How does that benefit me? It doesn't benefit me, because if I had realized that I did something wrong, I would have been vulnerable and say, you know what, sweetie, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have said it in that way. I shouldn't have done this, and so on.
Even if you had a point.
Only good comes from, if you think about it logically, of course, if I make a mistake and I admit it, only good. There's nothing bad that comes, except the ego can't take it. But the ego isn't you. So then you have a choice. Are you going to do what's better for you?
Or are you going to double down?
Or are you going to do what's better for your ego? And I think it's so important to start cleaving yourself from your ego and really coming to understand, wow, there's no logic in justifying this mistake. It's like the guy who gets lost but doesn't want to ask anybody for directions, right? What's the logic in that? Do you really want to spend the next half hour lost when you can just ask, you could admit, no, I don't know where I'm going, and I can ask for directions? No, but the ego is like, no, we're right. And if you don't know where you're going, nobody else knows where you're going, so it's not worth asking. But that's stupid, right? So if you have to really begin to develop, and this is not easy work, because the ego is so imprinted upon us as if it is a us, that it'll fight that. But if you think about it, if you really use logic, you'll see that there's only benefit in admitting that you didn't make a mistake.
By the way, the example of the car, right? So you don't ask for directions. That's not going to be the worst part of your day. Then it's going to be hours in the car, fighting with each other, looking for where you need to go. It leads to so many other things that are really the worst part of it, right? So even when I meet with couples and they're arguing, it's everything that happened after the ego decided that they couldn't be wrong that is the worst part of the argument. It's all the things that are said after, all of the ways they're trying to stand their ground and be heard, that really starts to chip away at the relationship or a friendship or your job or whatever else. It's not the initial thing usually, by the way. It's everything that now I have to defend my stance or I will suffer some kind of death. That's what ego makes you feel like.
Right. And so that's one part. There's two other parts I think are really important, right? This idea of needing acclamation and recognition from people outside of you. Again, think that through. Do you really care about it? Do you really care about what these people think? Well, the ego is going to tell you, yeah, absolutely, I'm desperate. I'm desperate for it. But, I always use this example, but when you're not in this world anymore, what's going to be important, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, what your kids thought, what your wife thought, what your husband thought, what your best friends thought. But does it really matter? And it's really important to what one other person who is not internal to you, who is not a deep and important relationship to you? Of course not. We all know that. We all know that.
But I 1,000% agree. But then when people go through their day, and this is why environment's so important. If you're all day looking at external, what did that thing look, even the things that you are watching, right? If that is now important to you, then that becomes the most important thing to you. So even though we're saying this, though, I think it's the step before that is, what are you busying yourself with every day? What are you looking at? What are you putting energy and effort into? How much time goes into all of those ways that you need to feel validated and for approval? And because if that's your world, it's very hard to do this part of what we're talking about.
Of course. But my hope is to inspire all of us to understand how silly a life directed by external, whether it's, accreditation, whether it's external support, anything that's not your core. We all know who our core people are, right? But we spend so much of life caring about the unimportant people in our lives. And the reality is that you're never going to do in life what you're meant to do if you spend, I was going to say a second, but certainly a lot of time caring about all the external people. And that's what so many people do. Well, we all do it at times, but so many of us do it so often. And it takes away our energy. I think it's important to understand that
then it becomes, we're chasing that then. It becomes who we are. It's not even, this is how you lose yourself in essence, and you don't even realize it.
Right.
You spoke about time. I think we all live and see the world through our own lens, right? So you have a desire for something, and then you go out to fulfill that desire. You're hungry, you go look for food. You want nice things, you get a job so you can have money, right? We live in that, and we need that to a certain extent. We live in that loop, but almost everything around us is focused on a singular idea, which is me, right? Which is you. And that's why this ego part's really tricky, because we do have to spend our day going after the things that we desire, right? So we have to check what that's rooted in, why we desire it. But even the things that we need, right? Food, shelter. But again, how much of that is beyond what you need, right? That is not me. It's focused on something else. So for instance, if we think about soul, we think about creator, everything about that energy is nothing for me alone. It's for everybody else to be part of. So if you look at your own world and the pursuit of that, if it's only rooted in what's going to fulfill me, how I'm going to feel about this experience, what I will look like, if that is the orbit, and right, we can hear it by the way that we go after the things that we go after, the way that we talk about them, the way that we see them, because there's no way to get out of lens of self unless you really try, because that's nature, right? I want something, I'm going to go get it. I need something,
but I want to make sure that's not misunderstood by our listeners. There's nothing wrong with worrying for the self. I think when it's exclusively for the self alone, correct, is where we can get into trouble. Because, like you said, it is important for us to work and have money and food and all the things that we want and we desire to have a great life. But like you said, at a certain point, it crosses over into external,
which becomes a self-important viewpoint, is what I'm saying, where it's overly. It just becomes about me, right? It's only desire to receive for the self alone.
I think that, again, if you're buying a steak, it's just for you, right? Or
yes.
I think where it crosses over is, again, I'll use the example. Let's say a person really enjoys cars. He gets a great car because he really enjoys it. And if there was nobody else in the world, he would still enjoy that car. That's on the right side.
Yes.
If he buys the car because he wants all of his friends to know, oh my God, I have money, or whatever those things are, then it's crossed over.
They'll like
it could be because, again,
it's the they when it becomes the they.
Right. The attention from.
But again, I guess what I'm saying, I think we're saying the same thing. I just said it differently. The me, right, that I'm talking about is that ego part, right? The me. How will I feel about this with all those people liking me because I have the car? That's what I'm referring to. We're saying the same thing, just differently. Versus our godlike nature, or you can call it soul, or you can, whatever you want to name it, right? But I think it's just in our pursuit of things that we do actually need. We need a car, right? We need food. We need a home. And we can really enjoy it, and it can be even lavish. Great. But when it becomes about how does everybody feel about me, it starts to develop it's a different organism then.
Right. Absolutely.
And that's when it becomes dangerous, and that's when we become blind.
Right. And the third aspect, which I think is really important, and this is something that Elliot Aronson speaks about at length as well, that the ego is also that force that forces us or tells us, play it safe. Why play it safe? Because if you try something new or bigger and you fail, what is everybody going to say? So the ego, because some people, we can confuse it with wanting more. No, the ego actually doesn't want more. The ego wants more if it's safe, but for you to take a chance that you might fail and other people might see you as a failure, don't do it. So the ego is just as powerful in a world, look at me, acknowledge me,
right?
As it is in keeping me small. Mm-hmm. So the ego is...
It's so tricky.
So, but the point is, next time
But let's say that again. It's really powerful because it's complete opposites, but it's not, right?
It's the same. It's the same force. The force that wants everybody, the ego wants to be recognized as amazing. Right? I am amazing. Look at me. I'm wealthy. I have this beautiful car.
And go
Look
and pursue
at me.
all these things that
I'm
are
successful. All these people like
that.
me.
Right.
And also that same logic will be like, oh my God, don't do that.
Can't make a mistake.
Because if you embarrass yourself, what are people going to think?
It's
right? If you
the
make
other
a mistake,
side of the coin.
Exactly. So it's exactly the same force. So I think it's really important. That's why when we began this episode, I said this is maybe the most important idea to think about. And I really hope our listeners take the time, because it's the force that pushes you to care and want external attention. It's the force that keeps you small. It's the force that doesn't let you learn from your mistakes. And the opposite of the ego, meaning fighting those three forces, is what makes life as it should be, with the blessings, with the light, with the growth. So this is not easy.
We all have ego. You just have to redirect it. You have to make sure you are the director, that your soul is.
Right, and not listen to these three very loud directions that it gives us every single day. Catch it, observe it, and catch it again and again. And I always say, how do you know if you're winning the battle of the ego? If you get excited, you get happy when you discover the next mistake you make.
There's two quotes I really like that pertain to this. One is by Carl Sagan said, "We're essentially microscopic beings living on a tiny mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam." Can't take yourself too seriously if you look at yourself like that. Neil deGrasse Tyson wrote, "When I look up in the universe, I know I'm small, but I'm also big. I'm big because I'm connected to the universe and the universe is connected to me." Just those little placeholders, right?
And what I would add to that is that we're small if we're directed by our ego. We're great if we're directed by our soul.
Exactly. That's why I like the two quotes.
Yeah.
So be malleable, be flexible, be expanding in your consciousness.
Yeah.
And with that, your consciousness has no interest in being right. It has only an interest in being and becoming.
And actually is excited to find the mistakes and change and grow from them.
I really feel like those are the high points of my day. Not that I enjoy them, but when I have that clarity, right, where I said something or did something that offended somebody, I get a pain in my heart when I'm aware of that, or like something with the kids, or with you, which is difficult sometimes.
Really?
No, those but again, whenever we do have an argument, it's not even an argument, it's a disagreement, but it's always a place of growth for us. And we always feel closer after, which is such a gift. But the only reason we get there is because we're both checking our ego.
Right.
And then from that place, after we've checked it, well, first, I think we recognize that something's bothering us. We talk about it. Then we might be bothered again by something else. We have a conversation. And then...
By the way, I apologized.
You did.
No, I said, by the way, you were bothered by the way I apologized.
No, by the way, you apologized. And we just leave it at that. By the way, you apologized. You did. And then you learn from it, right? And there's no reason to have an ego.
And that's where light and that's where blessings are.
And friendship and growth and truth and transformation.
Yes.
So
I really hope our listeners are inspired to do this work.
Let go of your ego.
Let go of my ego.
Let go of my ego.
It's a great time to remind our listeners to write 5-star reviews on this podcast, on Apple Podcasts, to share this podcast with everybody that you know, to continue to send your letters, comments, stories, inspirations to Monica and Michael at spirituallyhungry.life. And as always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast as much as we enjoyed recording it.
Stay spiritually hungry.